to Annapolis Mosaics. Our program spotlights people in our community who are involved in activities designed to promote good human relations. I am Michael Keller, the chair of the Annapolis Human Relations Commission and your host. The commission is a city board that seeks to promote equal opportunity and to eliminate discrimination. My guest today is Frank Dunbaugh, who is the executive director of the Maryland Justice Policy Institute. Frank,
good morning,
welcome. Welcome to Annapolis Mosaics.
Thank you.
Well, could you begin by sharing with our viewers highlights of your professional background and how it relates to your involvement with the Maryland Justice Policy Institute?
Well, the first part of my professional career was spent at the United States Department of Justice. And then I spent 20 years in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, starting less than a year after the division was formed. The division was formed by the 1957 Civil Rights Act, and I went in there in May of 1958. And while I was there, I worked on voting rights in Louisiana, and then on all sorts of civil rights matters through the Deep South. And eventually I was appointed to a policy position as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. So I served from Eisenhower's administration into Carter's administration. After I left there, I spent a year on the Hill working with the Subcommittee on Crime of the House Judiciary Committee. And then I left there and worked as a volunteer aide to Delegate Wendell Phillips when he was in the state legislature here. And at that time I was interested in prison matters and justice matters. And I testified before the Watts Committee that was appointed by Governor Hughes to determine whether or not they should build another prison. And the main thing that came out of that was that the commission found, based on information that I had given them, that the racial disparity in the Maryland prisons was very high and that they needed to find out why and do something about it. In 1993, Governor Schaefer had a commission. It was probably set up by the legislature. I think it was chaired by Elijah Cummings, in which they looked at things that were holding back young black men from advancement within the state. And in 1994, a group of us formed the Maryland Justice Policy Institute. So, but we had been involved in various prison issues before that.
Okay.
Does that give you much?
That's an excellent synopsis of your background and why you're so qualified to talk on this subject, Frank. Well, the Maryland Justice Policy Institute advocates a crime prevention program that, to quote your literature, invests in children, not prisons. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, the difficulty is that we are spending, and I don't know the exact figures in Maryland. I think I've heard it said in the United States we spend $81 billion on what I call the blame and punishment system. And we need to reduce that amount. In fact, many states are trying to reduce that amount by bringing down the prison populations and reinvest it in a crime prevention program. The difficulty in the Maryland effort to do that is the reinvestment turned out to be reinvesting in seeing to it that the people who are released from prison don't recidivate. But they're not putting the money on the children. And it seems to me that 15 years from now, the people who are in prison are people who are now in elementary and secondary schools in Maryland. They're now in school, and we should be reaching them and making sure they don't end up in prison. Marion Wright Edelman has started a campaign to cut off the pipeline from cradle to prison for young black men, and that's really where we need to go.
Okay. Well, you know, the public has two broad goals when it comes to the justice system, it seems to me. The first is preventing crime, and the second is repairing the harm that crime has done to its victims. So specifically, what would be the components of a program that would accomplish these objectives from your perspective?
Well, it's clear to me, at least, that the current, what we call the criminal justice system, doesn't do either one of those things. And we rely on a civil law system to repair the harm done to victims. And the civil law system is too expensive for most people, first of all. And secondly, many of the offenders don't have the money to pay the damages. And so we need to figure out ways that can make something easy to work to repair the harm. And we haven't done that. What I would suggest, of course, is that we follow a restorative justice system in which the so-called offender and the so-called victim meet with each other and with their support groups, their teachers, their preachers, their family members, their neighbors, whoever they need to bring them together to talk through what happened, why did it happen, and what can be done to repair it, and who can contribute to getting that done. In some countries where they do that, New Zealand uses it a lot. In New Zealand, every juvenile case must be sent to community conferencing before it goes to the courts. And what happens frequently is that the family of the offender will, build a recreation center for the children of that neighborhood if that's what's needed. They will do things of that sort. We have here in Maryland, the Maryland Community Conferencing Center, which is very good, well-staffed, and we don't use it as much as we should. The prosecutors seem to only want to send minor cases to them when they should be sending serious felony cases to them. It could replace the criminal law system, although that's not its purpose. Its purpose is to replace the civil law system. The criminal law system doesn't accomplish anything except hire a lot of people. And I guess it's a good thing to hire a lot of people, but if it's not achieving any public service, public purpose, why are we spending all this money on it?
So, the Institute has been critical of reforms that simply make adjustments to the criminal justice system, the current correction system, as we say. What aspects of that current correction system are you most critical of that you think is really not helping us as a society?
Well, I don't think it works at all. And the difficulty is that when people started to get into prison reform or into corrections or justice reform, which is what President Obama asked for, and a lot of the states have gotten into it, Maryland's gotten into it, is that the question they put out to the experts is, what do we need to do to repair the system or to fix the system? That puts them in a position of having to start with the premise that we're going to keep the system, rather than to say we need to do it over. I've said from time to time that what they're proposing is to adjust the carburetor on a car that has a broken block and 2 broken axles. Why do you want to do that? And we need to start from afresh with a whole different outlook. The need to have vengeance, the need take it out on somebody and harm somebody in order to feel that we've done something is wrong. It's not necessary. We double the harm, and why are we doing that? It doesn't help the victim. The alternative to the criminal law system is crime prevention, and crime prevention will never be successful if you think we can intimidate our young people into behaving the way we want them to behave by threatening them with the violence of prison or death penalty or whatever you want to threaten them with. What is needed is to inspire them with hope, not intimidate them with fear. And to inspire them with hope means you have to provide economic opportunities to them within the legitimate economy. We don't do that, and there are many, many unemployed young people, mostly black and mostly in the inner city, and they're the ones that are getting arrested for selling drugs on the corner. And you say, well, they chose to go into crime because they're evil. No, they didn't. They chose to go into crime because it was the only way for them to preserve their own lives and the lives of their family. So we're trying to fight against the human instinct of self-preservation. And that's the most powerful force in the universe other than gravity. And we're not going to be able to overcome it. You know, Coco Taylor explained it all to us in her blues song. You know, don't mess with Mother Nature. You'll be sorry if you do. She'll rain on your parade and stomp all over you.
When you talk about providing greater economic opportunities for youth, that seems to me that, you know, the heart of where you're going.
Yes.
Is that we need to move away from the punitive approach, and we need to provide, as you said, opportunities for youth, so that the focus really is going to be on the reducing the future individuals who engage in criminal activity, and at an early age direct them toward productive endeavors. Funds are so tight economically in our society. How do we actually go about doing that?
Well, I agree with you. The short-term costs may be somewhat high, but in the long range, we'll be much, much better off if we're not spending $81 billion on trying to hurt people. Mm-hmm. You know, it makes no sense. We don't get anything out of it. The program that's needed is a very comprehensive, complex program.
Okay. What would it consist of?
Well, some of the elements of it are this.
The details.
What's that?
Yeah, provide some details.
Okay, one of the elements of it is this, and that is that it's been said that many crimes have been committed by people who hate themselves. A woman who wrote a book about this about 30 years ago interviewed a lot of prisoners and a lot of former prisoners, and she found that they hated themselves. And they'd hated themselves since childhood because they were told that they did wrong in some event or other, and therefore they believed that they were bad children and that all their problems came from their own badness. And consequently, they became very antisocial and they engaged in crime eventually. What was recommended there was that, and this is the simplest, cheapest crime prevention program I can think of, would be for every church, every synagogue, every mosque, every school, PTA, any club, get together and bring in the young women and the young men and say to them, if you want your child to avoid going to prison, think this through. Do not tell them they're bad. Give them positive reinforcement when they're good. Try to straighten out when they're bad, but do not say you're a bad child because you did this or that. A lot of that comes from the fact that we do not teach our young people parenting skills. And so they don't understand childhood development. And as a consequence, they may expect a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old to behave as a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old would, and when they don't, then they take it out on the child. And that's what causes a lot of the problem. We need to teach our young people to be good parents. We need to teach them also contraception. If crimes are committed by people who aren't wanted, then there's only one group in the whole world that's trying to stop unwanted children, and that's Planned Parenthood, and yet people want to defund it. It makes no sense to me. It's a crime prevention program. If we teach our young people how to avoid becoming pregnant, how to avoid having children, too early. I mean, we have an economic system and a cultural system that's almost impossible, because we say to our children, you shouldn't have sex until you're married, and you can't get married until you're grown up, and you shouldn't get married until you finish school and have a job and you're making a lot of money. You're talking about 10 years of abstinence, at least 10 years, maybe 15, for people who were created with the potential of having sex when they're 12.
Okay. We're going to take a break now, but when we return, I'll be talking some more about the criminal justice system and possible areas of reform with Frank Dunbaugh.
Good evening. The special meeting of the Annapolis City Council for Monday, July 28th.
I'm talking today with Frank Dunbaugh, who is the executive director of the Maryland Justice Policy Institute. Frank, right now in the United States, we face a period of, I think, what could be called intense partisan polarization. And yet there is agreement in both of the parties and across the ideological spectrum for criminal justice reform. We see it on Capitol Hill with the cooperation between Senator Cory Booker, New Jersey liberal Democrat, and Senator Rand Paul, the libertarian conservative from Kentucky. And I recently had the opportunity to view a segment on the PBS NewsHour on this subject, in which the guests, rather than disagree with one another, actually were agreeing. And the guests for that particular segment was a representative of the American Civil Liberties Union and one of the Koch brothers. And they were agreeing about the need for reform in the criminal justice system. So what you have is, despite the tremendous divide that you have on Capitol Hill, the disagreements with President Obama and the Republicans, very few issues are generating a consensus that something has to be done. And criminal justice reform is one of those. The things you hear the most about, I'm going to let you react to this, the things you hear the most about, one of them is restorative justice. You hear a lot of advocacy for restorative justice. That's a concept whose time has come, and you spoke about that very well. But there's also talk about ways of reducing recidivism among today's prisoners. Not looking ahead toward future children, but reducing recidivism among current prisoners through things like more effective reentry programs and more stringent post-release supervision. And you also hear a lot of talk about the elimination of the mass incarceration that has led to the imprisonment of an extraordinary number of African American males. And you made reference to that earlier, that as a society we've got a disproportionate number of African American men in prison, and we know the reasons for that. The way the criminal justice system operates, from the police, who make the decision whether or not to issue an arrest, to the prosecutor, who make a decision whether or not to seek a prison sentence as opposed to lesser penalties, and to judges, who actually hand down the sentences. The result has been an increasing, proverbial, just a tremendous number of African American males who find themselves in prison. It's been described as the new Jim Crow, as another aspect to the repression of African Americans, starting with slavery, going through to the Jim Crow period, and now being incarcerated at a disproportionate number. Okay, where am I going with all this? Why shouldn't we be focusing? We talk about the criminal justice system. Why shouldn't we be focusing on current prisoners and how to ensure that the recidivism rate for those prisoners go down? And how do we go about changing the system so that you don't have this disproportionate number of African American males who find themselves behind bars and, in effect, as a result, subject to discrimination through their entire lives in ways that actually are, in some cases, worse than the old Jim Crow era. Because in the old Jim Crow era, the African American community stood behind each other. If you're convicted of a serious crime, you go to prison, you get out. A lot of times, the African American community doesn't want to deal with you. They just simply say, oh, no, you've been a troublemaker. So why shouldn't we be focusing on this?
Well, I think we do need to focus on it, but the difficulty is that the system, like the whole of American culture, is permeated with racism. Okay. And I've always thought that trying to eliminate racism from our culture is like trying to take too much salt out of the soup. It's not easily done. Okay. But the racism goes beyond the criminal law system and what happens within that system. Everybody knows that people who don't get a good education are more likely to end up in the justice system than people who get a good education. Well, for 100 years, we ran an educational system that was virtually non-existent for black people in many places. That isn't to say that it was terrible everywhere. Many black people who went to all black schools, turned out smarter than me, like my wife, for example. But the whole point of the segregated system was to try to tell these young children that they weren't worth anything. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, if you keep telling young children they're not worth anything, some of them are going to believe it. Mm-hmm. And it's going to ruin their lives for them. But there are many other things that contribute, and that is the way the laws are set, the tax laws and the inheritance laws and the copyright laws and all that are set. The people who have money are going to get to retain it. And having money is an important part of the inequality system. The people who don't have it are going to continue to be without it, and the people who have it are going to get more. And if we don't do something about that system, as Senator Sanders keeps telling us, we're going down the drain. We really cannot afford to keep going the way we're going. In my judgment, it's very important that the Sanders revolution, if there ever is one, must continue after the election. I don't know who will pick up the ball running with it. Bernie will probably go back to the Senate and be happy there where he belongs. But somebody needs to carry that ball. We need to continue that revolution. One of the important cultural traits that we have that is bad is that we believe, or many of us believe, I don't, but many of us believe that the world is made up of them and us. And I keep saying to people, we have to convert everybody to pogoism. And if you're old enough to remember Pogo, a cartoon character who said, "I found the enemy and he is us," would understand that. In my judgment, we are all descended from the same African woman. And there can be a debate about whether her name was Eve, or her name was Lucy, or her name was Artie, or she didn't come from Africa at all. But the fact of the matter is, we're all descendants of the same family, and we are all cousins of one another, and we all owe respect to one another. There is no them and us. The them and us justifies violence. We don't do violence to our own kind, we do violence to those other people, whoever they may be. And we shouldn't allow ourselves to consider anybody as not being part of us. And not being entitled to nonviolence.
Well, let's take a look at Maryland. Focus on that for a moment. What do you think of the actions that have been taken thus far in the area of criminal justice reform by Maryland's public officials?
It's 2 weeks so far.
Okay. Well, all right.
The legislature has handed down 2 mandates in 2015. They authorized a council to be formed, a coordinating council to be formed, and they gave them 2 mandates. One, make recommendations on how to reduce the prison population. And if you say that it costs $35,000 to $50,000 a year to keep people in prison, you could save a lot of money if you reduce the prison population. And the second mandate was to reinvest that money that's saved to improve public safety. And as you pointed out, they limited that basically to recidivism by current prisoners rather than dealing with the future. We have, over the years, thrown away 4 or 5 generations. That we've just given up on them and let them go to prison, let them starve, let them do whatever happens to them. We've got to stop that. At some point, we have to start saying that from here on out, all of the children, all of the grandchildren need to have an equal opportunity, a chance. And there's a lot of different reasons they don't have it. I believe that most of the human rights we need are set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was voted for by the United States, but the implementing covenants have never been ratified by the United States. India, for example, has decided that the Universal Declaration provides a right to food, and therefore the Supreme Court of India ruled that the state had to pay for free lunches for the children in the schools. The United States Supreme Court, on the other hand, ignoring the Universal Declaration, as they always do, decided that there is no right to education in the United States.
Frank, I'm sure that our viewers are going to be possibly wanting to dialogue with you about this. How could they reach you if they want to get in touch with you about the about the Institute?
They could email me.
Okay, could you give us your email address?
Right, it's Frank, F-R-A-N-K, Dunbaugh, D-U-N-B-A-U-G-H. No space or dots or anything between those two. Frank Dunbaugh at mail.com, C-O-M.
Thank you for viewing our program today, and please join us again on Annapolis Mosaics. If you would like more information about the Annapolis Human Relations Commission, jot down the information on the screen. You can reach us at 410-263-7998 or by email at hrcommission@annapolis.gov, or check out our page at the City of Annapolis website. Go to www.annapolis.gov, click on the city government icon, then Boards and Commissions, and then scroll down to the Human Relations Commission page. And always remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We have flown the air like birds and swum the seas like fishes, but have yet to learn the simple act of walking the earth as brothers and sisters."